Thank you all so much for being here for this keynote, this final keynote of the 2022 edition of Getting Real. I also just want to quickly thank all of the people who are making this event possible. That includes everyone from the audience, virtually and in this room, and in the other room across the hall, to our incredible accessibility colleagues here who have been translating, interpreting, and doing captioning work this entire weekend. And to especially, I want to thank my staff, my colleagues, discuss. I want to thank the staff of the IDA and everyone who has been giving their time, and our volunteers who are running around, and all of the speakers who have been giving their time. I just named a bunch of people, sponsors too, lots of people involved. But can we give everyone just a quick round of applause for their generosity? Thank you. So you are here to hear a keynote speech. Actually, a keynote conversation is probably a more apt term for what you're about to experience. So when we were deciding, the programming team here, Jonathan, Ali, and Abby Sun, the conference director, and I, when we were having a conversation about keynotes, I think we were definitely wanting to think about the conference at large and what sort of conversations would be happening in the space over the past 3 days. And I think one of the kind of interesting tensions that exists whenever you are planning what is a quote unquote industry conference is that there is, in fact, this industry, these systems that we all have to kind of acknowledge that exist, that have these kind of streaming organizations that have outrageous amounts of money, to independent artists and wanting to kind of, how to speak in both those places. And I think an artist who has managed to sustain a career while being true to himself for decades. Anand Patwardhan, as hopefully many of you already know, is one of the great filmmakers of our lifetimes, in my opinion. He's been making an incredible body of work over decades that has been covering all sorts of topics. He's been making films such as Bombay, Our City, which is looking at the films like In the Name of God and Reason, these films that are looking at conflicts in very local situations, but also the country of India at large and the rise of Hindu nationalism. And throughout that entire time, Anand has been working very much independently, I would say, in collaboration with others for sure, and definitely with community in mind, but he has not been going to the major streaming organizations to make his livelihood, for instance. He's a very independent artist. But beyond that, I think something that is actually maybe more important beyond the fact that he's a brilliant artist that's important to talk about is just that he's also a just generous person. And I think that's actually maybe the most important thing and the value that I think I want to lift up when we're talking about him. I've talked with, and I think, but like, speaking of my colleagues, we have talked with many artists who have kind of viewed him as a mentor, as a person to look up to, and a person who has always been there, and a person who has gone out of his ways to set up screenings, makeshift screenings, to make sure that his films actually reach the communities that they're made alongside, that they actually make a difference. And he's fought for filmmakers against systems over that entire time, quite thanklessly, I think. So it's a huge honor to have him here. And I also want to say that we are doing this as a conversation. So we are joined. Blair McClendon is one of those names where I'll speak for myself. He kept appearing in like different contexts where I would be blown away by an essay that he wrote. And then I would be watching a movie and would see the similar name in the credits. I don't know if any of you have seen some of the films that he's edited. He's straddled the fiction, nonfiction divide. Making as After Sun is a film that just premiered. After Sherman, you have a lot on the circuit right now. And addition to that, The Assistant by Kitty Green, but also has written some unbelievable essays in places like N+1. He wrote an essay, and I'm sorry, Blair, can you remind me the name of the essay that you wrote in 2020, the summer of 2020? Such Things Have Done Harm. If you are one of our virtual attendees, I really just want you to take a quick second to like Google this and make sure that you have read it. It's an article in N+1 that is the most brilliant piece of writing that asks questions about what filmmakers have to do. So anyway, we're very here, who himself is a very independent artist who has great thoughts about politics and what have you. So I'm going to turn it over to you all soon. Housekeeping. Watching a clip reel, actually 3 different clips from movies that Anand directed over the years. They're the films that I actually mentioned. We'll be starting out with a clip from Bihar City. Then we'll be going to In the Name of God, and then Reason. We can unpack the reasons for these specific clips maybe afterwards, but just a very quick thing I would say is that they are all talking a little bit about some of the tensions that I think he has dealt with in his films, but also some of the risks that he's had to take and how they've surfaced. So with that being said, maybe we can start the clips and then we'll go into this conversation. So thank you all so much for being here, and happy getting real.
बाल बच्चा का अपना तो लेके फुटपाथ पे पड़ेला है। तुम तो टिपोटर में तो अपना आवाज भर लेता है, फिर वो गरीब गोरू का कुछ करता है कि नहीं करता? हाँ, उधर सोना भी नहीं देता, खाना पकाना भी नहीं देता और कुछ भी नहीं है। वो बच्चा का एक्सीडेंट भी हो गया कल, रक्षा का नीचे आया बच्चा रात को, रोड पे सोए यहाँ पर। अभी अपना कहाँ रहेगा, कहाँ जाएगा? अपना कुछ है इलाज? कोई गरीब के लिए है? कोई भी नहीं। हाँ, 4 महीने तो अपने को बारिश के लिए तो बंदोबस्त करो, बारिश जाने के बाद में अपन कहाँ भी चले जाए। 4 महीने के लिए मुंह छुपाने को तो जगह दो, उतना भी मुंह ना छुपाने को जगह देता तुम लोग। खाली अपना कहना करने का, अपना नाम बढ़ाने का, फोटो निकालने का, बस। अपना क्या करता है तुम लोग ने? तो कुछ नहीं कर सकते। इतना बड़ा गवर्नमेंट ने अपने को फेंक दिया, तुम और हम क्या कर सकते हैं? कुछ नहीं कर सकते। गरीब का फूट मत खेचो, इसमें तो बहुत ही है। का खेचे से गरीबाची फूट? पैसे वालों का है, गरीब का कोई नहीं है। कोई साथ देने वाला नहीं गरीब का।
मंदिर वही बनाएंगे, मंदिर वही बनाएंगे। रामचंद्र महाराज लाठी गोली खाएंगे, मंदिर वही बनाएंगे। लाठी गोली खाएंगे, मंदिर वही बनाएंगे। लाठी गोली खाएंगे।
एक 462 साल पहले एक लुटेरे ने आकर अगर हमारे मंदिर को ध्वस्त किया है तो ये हमारे माथे पर कलंक है। अगर ये बाबरी मस्जिद रहेगी तो हिंदुओं पर ये कलंक हमें अपनी गुलामी याद दिलाता रहेगा। अरे हम इसको को उठा कर रहेंगे, ये गुलामी का चिन्ह है, इसे हम खत्म करेंगे, चाहे खून से करें चाहे गोलियों से करें। हाँ।
और मस्जिदें 3,500 खड़ी बड़ी। अरे भगवान भी तो हम ही हैं। भगवान का रूप हमारे अंदर है, हम जाएंगे तो मस्जिद भी तोड़ेंगे। भगवान का रूप हमारे अंदर वो, अगर वो इसको कलंक को अपने माथे पर लगा करके रखना चाहते हैं, ये उत्तर प्रदेश की सरकार, ये मुलायम सिंह, तो वो बना करके इसको उठा करके और कहीं रख ले, लेकिन मंदिर वही निर्माण होगा गर्भगृह पर, गर्भगृह के ऊपर ही मंदिर निर्माण होगा।
लेकिन अब पंजाब की तरह से हम अपने हाथों में रिवॉल्वर पकड़ेंगे। हम गवर्नमेंट सर्वेंट के अध्यापक हैं, लेकिन आप छोड़ देंगे कलम और पकड़ेंगे रिवॉल्वर।
एक गौर कीजिए कि महात्मा गांधी को भी गोली किसने चलाई?
गॉडसे ने।
गॉडसे कौन था?
हिंदू। हाँ। क्यों चलाई?
क्यों चलाई?
अगर सरकार का यही रवैया रहा तो हर आदमी गॉडसे ही बन जाएगा फिर तो।
तो आप समझते हैं कि जो गोडसे ने गांधी की हत्या की वो अच्छी बात थी?
हाँ बिल्कुल सही किया है उन्होंने, बिल्कुल सही किया है। जो इस देश के साथ गद्दारी करेगा उसका यही अंजाम होगा। और एक बात, चाहे वो मुलायम सिंह हो चाहे वीपी सिंह हो, उसका अंजाम यही होगा। लेकिन हम यहाँ धर्म नगरी में आए हैं, मंदिर का निर्माण करने आए, लड़ने नहीं आए हैं।
महात्मा गांधी की भी हत्या आपका आप समझेंगे ठीक है?
बिल्कुल सही किया है उसने, गोडसे ने कोई गलत नहीं किया। और धिक्कार है कि जो 70 करोड़ हिंदुओं को एक तरफ रख करके 10 करोड़ मुसलमानों के तलवे चढ़ता फिर रहा है। धिक्कार है ऐसे हिंदू होने पर।
अच्छा, आप कौन से जात के हैं?
हम हिंदू हैं, खत्री।
हाँ?
खत्री सबसे पहले हिंदू, उसके पीछे जात।
अच्छा, उसके मगर जात कौन सी आप?
छत्री, छत्री,
क्षत्रिय यानी राज?
अरोड़ा, अरोड़ा भैया, अरोड़ वंश के हैं हम। और हारे हैं भैया, इनको पूरा कर लेने दो, हमारा झगड़ा इंटरव्यू पूरा कर लेने दो। हाँ
समस्त हिंदू बंधू भगिनी आणि मातांनो, सनातन संस्थेचे संस्थापक परात्पर गुरु डॉक्टर आठवले ही अखिल मानव जातीच्या उद्धारासाठी कार्यरत असलेली विभूती आहे। हिंदू राष्ट्राची स्थापना हेच त्यांच्या जीवन कार्याचे उद्देश आहे। समस्त हिंदुत्वादी संघटनांच्या वतीने आयोजित भव्य एकता हिंदू दिंडीचे आगमन होणार आहे। दिंडी ही हिंदूंच्या ऐक्यासाठी, दिंडी गोरक्षणासाठी, दिंडी हिंदू महिलांच्या रक्षणासाठी, दिंडी राम मंदिराच्या उभारणीसाठी, शौर्य व्यर्थ जाऊ नये म्हणून उपासना, उपासना शक्तीची, तन मन धन आणि प्रसंगी प्राण देणाऱ्या क्रांतीपुत्रांची। हिंदूंना दुबळेपणा सोडा, शौर्याहून श्रेष्ठ काहीच नाही। आपल्या शत्रूशी दोन हात कसे करावेत, आपल्या हिंदूंच्या देवी देवतांच्या हातात देखील शस्त्र आहे। त्याच्यामुळे समस्त हिंदूंनी या शस्त्राची उपासना करणं आज काळाची आवश्यकता आहे। आर्य सनातन वैदिक हिंदू धर्म की
मैंने ऐसा नहीं कहा कि भाजपा शासन से पुलिस पर दबाव है। हमने ये कहा कि एक हाइप क्रिएट किया जा रहा है। आज ये हुआ कि जब कलबुर्गी की हत्या हुई तो यहाँ पर एक आंदोलन हुआ, जो एशियाटिक लाइब्रेरी के शेयर केस पर एक आंदोलन हुआ। जो इंटेलेक्चुअल है जैसे कपिल पाटिल है, आनंद पटवर्धन है, ये लोगों ने वहां का आंदोलन किया और पुलिस ने उसको होने दिया। क्यों नहीं उन्होंने आनंद पटवर्धन की हड्डियां तोड़ी, क्यों नहीं? तो ये जब होता है तब गुस्सा आता है, गुस्सा आता है।
सगळ्या पत्रकार परिषदेच्या समोर जे आता बोला की आनंद पटवर्धन, कपिल पाटील यांना मारायची, काही झालं तर त्याला तुम्ही जबाबदार राहा।
तो मैं यहाँ खड़ा हूँ, आपको कोई कार्रवाई करनी है तो
नहीं देखा है।
आपके संगठन में एक आतंकवादी गतिविधियों को बढ़ावा दे रहा है।
दाभोलकर, कलबुर्गी और पानसरे की हत्या में भी मैंने कभी ये नहीं कहा है कि इसमें कोई हिंदुत्ववादी का हाथ हो ही नहीं सकता। मैं ये झूठ नहीं कहूंगा क्योंकि जो बातें हुई है वो हुई है। पानसरे ने जे टाइप के भाषण दिए थे, जिस तरीके से वो कर रहे थे, तो शायद कोई फैनेटिक ये करे, इसकी संभावना से मैं इनकार नहीं कर रहा हूँ। हमने इसको मान्यता दी।
So I thought we would start with something that actually Chris mentioned, which is sort of this question of independence. When we were talking before about this conversation that came up really early on, you have been able for a very long time to maintain both this editorial and financial independence in creating this work. What about that? And how do well, I guess the real question is, how do you define independence in independent filmmaking? And why has that been such an important part of your process in making these films?
Well, I never became a filmmaker because that's what I really wanted to do. I mean, I didn't know that I wanted to do that. I became filmmaker almost by accident, because I was participating in movements that I thought the best way to spread this is to actually do something. I mean, I could have written articles, but there's not that much literacy. So an audiovisual medium was a good one to use. And so I got into it slowly over time. And then eventually it became the way that I could contribute the best was to do this. As far as independence is concerned, it also, one of the reasons was that I was always making films that were critical of the government of the day. I'm talking about over 50 years. And because I was doing that, there was always the possibility, almost a certainty, that they would accuse, if I had taken money from outside sources, like if I was raising money internationally for my filmmaking, and there was no money to be raised in India very easily, then I could be accused of that this was a foreign hand. Somebody else was saying this and using me as a medium. So I decided to not do that and raise the money for filmmaking through, initially from my parents or friends, borrowing equipment. So all of these, for a long time, the films were made with very poor equipment, borrowed from other people, and a lot of free labor from my friends who helped in doing camera until I learned how to do camera myself over time. But yeah, so even though the films are very low budget, the budget is actually invisible because it depends on a lot of free labor of other people.
And why have you both sort of across the time then maintained that streak, or is it also sort of the same thing? Or
it's so that is one of the reasons that it would be seen as something somebody else was saying, but also I grew up at a time when corporations were seen as the evil. I mean, it's not like today where it's perfectly okay to go to whatever big foundations and big, we saw that as dirty money sometimes. So we wanted to do this an oppositional practice that would not depend on all that kind of funding. And also, I was very conscious that if I'd got big money from anywhere, one particular source, that they would control what I had to say, or they would tell me how to say it. And so what I chose as a practice was to try and sell the films after they were made, but not to take money beforehand in production money. If there was a pre-sale of some kind at some point, and I would know that this would be shown no matter how long it is or what it was saying, then that would be okay. But to actually get, and so when you look at any of my films, you never see long credits at the end with all the people who put money in it. Yeah.
What's the process been for you then in finding collaborators? What are you sort of looking for when you're meeting these people who are helping you out with this?
No, so collaborators are basically, as I said, there are no collaborators in the production process in terms of funding, but there are people who've helped. Sometimes the movements that I was filming sometimes would contribute as well, but usually that didn't happen because they didn't have any money. On one occasion, the fish workers union put some money in, and that helped to finish the film. But even that was very rare.
You mentioned in a second ago too about sort of where they would be seen after the fact, and you've always been very intentional about how your films get seen and making sure they actually get seen in places that you're working in. Could you talk a little bit about what was sort of the impetus for that, and also what the process is for getting a lot of these screenings happening?
So I think I can relate it to one of the clips. In fact, we chose that clip because it sort of highlights the issue. That was a clip from the first one that you saw, Bombay, Our City, where the homeless person is turning back and saying, "Why are you filming the poor? You're going to get rich and famous doing this, but it's going to do nothing for us." So that was a question that I had to address every time I made a film, because we're often making films about other people's misery and other people going through. I mean, I saw it as an injustice to them, but but I couldn't, unless I was sure that, or not sure, but unless I thought there was a potential that my filmmaking was actually going to help in that situation, there was no ethical right to go ahead and make a film like that. So that meant that after the film, when the film was made, then we had to make sure that it's used in that way. So we often did lots of screenings in working class audiences, putting up a big screen. I mean, that's a clip that we didn't have time to show. Maybe if we wrap this up early, there's a 4-minute music video that made about the screenings that we did in mainly in working class neighborhoods. Although I didn't only show films in working class neighborhoods, I also showed it in colleges, basically wherever they were willing to show it. Yeah.
That section in Bombay City had always struck me, where she's asking the question that I think sort of is always stalking a bit documentary and journalism and any of these things. And you've spoken a little bit just there about why you included that back in, but I wanted to sort of push a bit on something we had talked about before, which is sort of like this question of what's the ethical way to make a film and what's the political way to make a film. And you've talked a little bit about coming out of these movements. How do you sort of in your work, how have you been reconciling sort of the answer of like what a film can do? Like what, from the moment that she pushes back on you, what's the point of this thing? What keeps you going in making that work?
So basically, this kind of filmmaking, documentary filmmaking, is an act of voyeurism. I mean, we are actually looking at things that are happening to people in real life. And the only right that you have to do, I mean, you give yourself that right if you can convince yourself that this is going to be useful to the people that you're filming. And that, in that particular case, this was the first time we had gone to that area. So she didn't know us at all. And she assumed that we were like most journalists that were going to take pictures. She thought these were photographs because the camera was, movie camera didn't even occur to her at the time. So, but later when we finished the film and we showed the films in that area, and she loved it so much, she wanted to see the film again and again and show it to everyone, because it was also an act of empowerment to see yourself on a big screen when you had only so far seen movie stars on those scenes on the big screen. So yeah, so I think that I did successfully convince myself that these were of some use. Yeah.
And you said before, that you turned to filmmaking not with the intention of I'm going to be a big star, but coming out of those movements. Do you still consider yourself to be a member of those struggles? And if so, how do you feel that the work you're continuing to do, like where do you slot yourself in those movements?
Yeah, but meaning there is truth in what she said, and I made a name for myself over time of being a filmmaker, and so I have privileges that don't exist for everybody, yeah. So I'm not sure. Yeah, just to repeat that.
Yeah, I mean, basically the question of sort of that you said your interest in filmmaking rose out of your work in other movements. And I was wondering now, how do you feel yourself, like where you slot yourself in those?
Yeah, I think that especially today, where there's so much fake news and so much right-wing propaganda out there in a country like India, and I'm sure in a country like America also, that these oppositional moments are very important. And it's not only, I also think so because I know that the state doesn't want us to show these films. They try to suppress them all the time. So which actually tells me that we're on the right track and we're saying something useful. If only we could get an audience. Yeah.
I'm thinking a little bit more too about something we were talking about that I think kind of comes out of that question, is that you've been in this very particular place where, because of your commitments, You often are filming, people who are for many different reasons quite different from you. And there's been lots of discussion here, pretty much everywhere in media and arts, about sort of like who gets to tell whose story. And I'm wondering, how do you approach that question, and why do you keep doing this work? What has set you up to find value in being that opposition, even if you are in some ways outside it?
Even if I'm privileged in comparison to many times in comparison to the people that I'm filming. But basically, I offer what I'm doing. I mean, I see my role as a role of somebody who's offering solidarity, of someone who's using that position of privilege to address things which, if, like, for instance, if a Muslim had made in India, had made in the name of God or reason, it would be, their life would be in much more danger than mine is. So I think that I'm using that privilege that I have to be able to say something that is of, so it doesn't, and I don't see it as taking away the space for people from the communities to also make films, as and when that can be done, and it is being done slowly more and more. So it's not a competition between us. I think we're on the same side.
And this is sort of speaking more broadly, because over the course of your career, there's a way to look at your body of work and see, oh, you can chart a certain political tendency that gains ascendancy over the course of the times of these films, culminating obviously in Reason. I guess the question is sort of, how do you engage now looking back at that body of work? As you said just a minute ago, I've been saying Modi's name, but it didn't stop him getting elected. How do you engage now looking back at all of this work where you are kind of sounding an alarm repeatedly?
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, you could say that, I mean, not that I'm some great soothsayer, but
your eyes were open.
But yeah, at least since the 90s, I've been talking about the rise of fundamentalism. And in the 90s, it wasn't taken seriously, even though the evidence was right there. And now we're on the road to fascism. It hasn't reached a full-blown fascism, but it's on that path, and you can see it very clearly. So I think the films as a body of work, if you look at that, you see the whole trajectory that's been happening. It's been happening long before I started making films. It's been happening for 100 years. So, and people have documented, people have written about it. But again, all our voices put together are not reaching a kind of critical mass where everybody wakes up and says, this is not the right path. So, yeah, I think, it's too early to compare it with early days of Nazi Germany, but you see the phenomena, and you see that people are not actually paying attention. I'm not talking only about people in India, I'm talking about internationally. People are not paying attention.
In something like Reason, that just feels like so clearly a mapping of, here is a descent into something. At what point, sort of in making Reason, did it occur to you like that's sort of the container of this, that you're plotting sort of this loss of reason? Was that like from the get-go, you were thinking that's the trajectory of this, or did that come together over the long process of making it? Because it took quite a while to make.
Yeah, the Reason took 3 years. The film before that took 14 years.
Speeding up.
Yeah. So no, but I keep losing my train of thought. I'm sorry. Yeah,
I can make it a straighter question, which is just sort of how in making.
No, there was nothing wrong with the question. There's something wrong with my memory. Yeah.
Could be both.
Yeah.
Just sort of how did you get to that container of loss of reason as a way to sort of think through all of this footage and through these phenomena?
Yeah. So one thing is that in the early days, we were branded as communists. We were, left wing. That was the insult. Well, for them, it's an insult. So, and we were, but over time, the left wing, it's no longer necessary for them to say left wing or socialist or whatever. Even democracy became they would claim democracy, but they would deny it to everybody else. And they, to the extent that now the word intellectual is used as a pejorative. So that's how reason comes into it, because the act of reason is already becoming an act of treason.
I don't mean to put the what is to be done question to you.
Yeah.
But I do think sort of in rewatching your work, preparing for this, like I was saying, you can see it really does chart the rise of something or the descent into something. And as you're saying, it's like, it's not even now you're a communist and there's this tradition that you sort of are calling on out here. But what sort of, when you look at this, when you see something standing on the brink and you are still going out there and still making work, what direction are you looking in? What are you thinking about? How do you turn this around?
Well, my response to when I'm called that or have been is that, I believe in nonviolent action. I've been always, if you look at all the films, there's never a moment where I'm talking about some armed struggle, overthrow of the state. I'm talking about nonviolent processes and people who are using nonviolence to fight back, to resist. And so it's really far-fetched for them to see me as some kind, or not me alone, I'm talking about a whole lot of people who are in jail right now, who are in jail for non-violently resisting, for non-violently talking about the injustices that have been carried out, or the atrocities or the killings of minorities, and they're sitting in jail. So that is the period we're going through right now. Yeah, so mine is just a small act of solidarity with them.
I'm just thinking of it now because you've said the word solidarity twice, and also because I like that word. Where does that sort of figure in for you, I guess? Because I think that does, to me, what I liked about your answer earlier is it really does unlock, I feel like, a lot of these questions about identity and telling these stories and what's the move forward is like a question of, are you working from a position of solidarity or not? And I'm wondering now, sort of in this position, what you're describing, where the people who you are, on the same side as are being imprisoned or, under attack, as things sort of ratchet up, which I think is, a question obviously here in lots of places around the globe. What does that solidarity demand of you? What does it demand of the work you keep making? Does that change sort of what the work is, how you make it, where you're showing it? I guess I'm just saying, how do you feel that your work changes according to the conditions you're in?
Very honestly, I don't think my work has changed that much. I mean, I went from very poor quality black and white to, after some time, to color. And then from color, 16 millimeter, I went to high 8 video, and from high 8 to mini DV. And until the last film that I made, Reason, that was the first film that I made on high definition. So we haven't reached 4K yet. So we're yeah. So that's the only change that I see. I mean, and also I got a little better in terms of camera work. I mean, and I got probably a little better as an editor. But I don't think my thought process changed very radically. And maybe I tried to avoid being didactic, which might have been a little more didactic earlier. And I don't think I'm less didactic, but it's better disguised. Yeah.
What made you feel like you should disguise the didacticism?
No, I mean that basically what I'm trying to do is to get the audience to think it out. So I don't want to say this is what it is. I just want to present the evidence. And so I think I'm being like a lawyer. And I actually had to become sort of a lawyer because my films were always in court. So I'm trying to present evidence. I take a lot of care to not make factual mistakes, and I'm willing to change anything if something is that I have made a factual mistake, and I can correct it. Especially in the days of video, in the days of celluloid, it was hard to correct anything. So I'm basically making an argument. And that's what I mean by still being didactic in a sense, but allowing the audience to come to those conclusions rather than me providing the conclusions.
I know we don't have loads of time left, so I don't want to totally monopolize all the questions I want to ask him. We'll open it up a bit to the folks who are talking online. Also, if folks are in here, I will try to see your hand from here. It's a little bright, so I might not. But I will point
So
in your general
one
direction.
thing that we should revisit slightly is that, when we were talking about distribution or funding, I do think that there's something wrong in a system internationally where so much emphasis is put on pitching to people who are not necessarily from the community that is making the film or the film is about, but pitching to people who are gatekeepers, and you go. I've seen people do it. I didn't do it myself, but I witnessed. I was in Amsterdam and I saw pitching sessions. So how it's done. It felt like a gong show. So you're like 3 minutes and you're out. And anyway, so it probably brings out the lowest common denominator in how a film is made. So I think that there needs to be internationally space for the one-off documentary that is made with passion by people who raised the money themselves in one way or the other and then were able to say this. But there is no space because what has happened now over time is that if you don't take money from someone to make a film, your film becomes invisible. You don't know what to do. You know what to do with it, but it can't be done. Yeah. So you can't get it on TV. Like most of my films have never been on TV. Or there's in the early days in the 80s, some of them did get onto Channel 4. One got onto BBC. In a shorter version. Luckily I was allowed to make the shorter version myself. So I don't mind that so much. But Reason has not been shown anywhere in the world except in there's someone from Taiwan Fest. TV did show a shorter version of Reason. So it's just like a blockade against this kind of cinema, that because you didn't take anybody's money, nobody's interested in pushing it. So I think we do need to fight for space on at least on public channels where such films there can be a slot created for independent documentaries that are independently made.
Any folks out here? Can I pass this to you real quick? But we have moments for a few questions. So if anybody in the room has one before we get the chat up and running. We got somebody there.
Hi, I really appreciate you speaking today. Apologize, that's really loud. My name is Sadie. Thank you both for your time. I'm curious how you balance the urgency of making a film like Reason or something that feels very timely with the desire to make it right and to let it take its time and to get involved and really know a community so that it doesn't feel like an outsider coming in and telling someone else's story. You said you worked on one documentary for 13 years.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
It's not that I wanted to make it that takes so long, but and it's not that I made only one film in those 14 years. I made actually two films because at one point I got involved with two different things at the same time. But it took 14 years because that film kept growing. I started with one. I started because the police had killed 10 people from the Dalit community who were considered low caste, untouchables. And they just shot into where they lived and killed 10 people on the spot. And so, and a friend of mine whom I had filmed in Bombay City, in fact, from the Dalit community, was a musician who witnessed this act and committed suicide. He hung himself in his own tiny home. And so I started exploring his music, which I'd recorded previously, a lot of it. And then since he was no more, I started looking at other musicians from the community. And I started following the court cases that began because of this police killing, both by the police and by the police put cases on the people they'd shot at on the community, which always happens to cover up their tracks. They put counter cases. So as all these court cases unraveled, time kept passing. So that's how it ended up 14 years. And I think I could do this precisely because I wasn't making a commissioned film. Nobody was saying that now you've got to deliver it and it's got to be this long. So that act of independent production frees you to do the film that needs to be done. Although I finally finished it because the film needed to be shown as well. It was not, you couldn't just sit on it making it. You had to actually get out there and start screening it. So we did lots of screenings, and that's the clip that I wanted to show at the end, if we have the time, of how we did screenings.
I just wonder how, if primarily you're an activist, how do you cope with the frustration that you're making films in order to inform if they don't get shown and they don't get a wide audience? I mean, are you working it and going around and showing them locally?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to show you, how we, well, we're not doing that at this moment, because at this moment, even that has become so dangerous or difficult to do. Now the screenings that we do are word of mouth, get an audience without advertising it, without telling anybody. And yeah.
But essentially you're preaching to the converted because you're showing it to communities who know it's going on. And I just really appreciate your comment about the way documentary's going.
I don't think anybody's actually converted in that sense, in the sense that, and even when you show it to people who somewhat agree with what you're saying, it's a morale booster, which is needed because people are depressed by the fact that there's no resistance. So it's important to show it even if people sort of agree, but it's not true that people across the board agree. I mean, even people from the middle classes and where we do college screenings and other screenings, there's always lots of disagreement. To the extent that the right wing now, the right wing used to come to heckle us and to try and stop the screening or, mess up the discussion afterwards by asking, by being obnoxious in the Q&A. But they started to lose people. They started to actually, some of the people who watched the films started to, be taken aback because it's not the story they had been told. So I do believe that these kind of films have the power to change people's perception, and that's precisely why they're not being allowed to be seen widely. And as I said, even internationally, the stories that need to be told are not being told in the way they need to be told. Because when something has the real power to change something, be a systemic way to stop it. There obviously is, otherwise we wouldn't be in the mess that we are, even in terms of the environment and everything else.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your work. It's the first time I've seen it, and it's really interesting. The first clip where the woman is speaking about being exploited in the image, how have you reconciled that over your career? How do you engage your subjects so that they don't feel exploited?
So as I said, even in that particular case, she didn't feel exploited at the end when she actually saw the film. And so that is an ongoing question. That is something that you can never be reconciled with fully. You can't be sure that you are not, and in fact, it's most of the time true that the filmmaker is getting more out of it than the subjects are. But an awareness of that keeps you as honest as you can possibly be.
Yeah, I'm not sure where the mic is. Thank you both. Oh, sure.
Okay. Yes, thank you. I was curious if you have if you mentioned solidarity and sort of being in solidarity with communities when making work or thinking about work. And I'm curious if you have a process of sort of interrogating yourself or your own filmmaking, like whether or not you might be avoiding looking at certain truths or kind of like maybe being less subjective or anything like that. Do you have a process of kind of interrogating your own views as you're making a film? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. But I think that the moment you put that process down on paper or think it out theoretically, it's no longer probably true. Because this has to be an internal process. It has to be something that you internalize in a way that makes you produce something of use to the people that you're filming. That is something that it's not something that you could, I mean, there's so many theories about all this. I mean, there's like, the act of being self-reflexive, showing your camera in this, that all that happened because there were two cameras and somebody captured me while I was filming, which is most of the time not the case. Most of the time I'm behind the camera and there's, you might hear my voice, but you won't see the picture. So it's not a theoretically thought out process for me. And I don't think it actually can be. It would become artificial if I laid formula for myself to follow. It has to, I mean, that's what I mean. That's why I always find the theoretical question of ethics problematic, because it's something that is much more a package deal of many things, of all that you grew up with and all the values that you have. It's not something that you necessarily teach yourself consciously, anyway. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think we probably only have time for one more question. If there's somebody out there who has a burning thing they need to know. I think I see a hand. Oh, we could do that. That's true.
Yeah,
That's
I'd
true.
like you to see the clip if we have 4 minutes.
Oh, I think we don't. I think they're saying we don't.
You'd have to imagine it. Yeah. So Let me describe it to you. I mean, it's basically how, we put up bamboo poles and put up bed sheets, and then the films, we play a lot of music to gather the audience in the community. We play, we choose the music carefully, but we often even play old Bollywood songs, which were not, it wasn't Bollywood in those days. I mean, because in the 60s and 70s, we still had a lot of progressive culture, and a lot of films were made by people who were on the side of the majority. So we play those kind of songs and attract the audience, or in the, and that's what brings the big audience together, and then we start with the films. So anyway, I'm describing it as a bad idea. It would have been, it was much nicer if you'd seen it.
If I could use the LA City Council community meeting protocol and concede my time so we could watch the clip, that would be great.
I think it's a question of whether it will work or not, but I do deeply appreciate what you just
We need to wrap it up.
All right. We will, I think from the way we need to wrap it up, we will wrap it up. I just want to say quickly, obviously, thank you for coming. And
if anybody wants to email me, I'll send them the clip. Yeah.
You could all email and get the clip in as quick a way as possible. I think we'll end this. I know you've been asked this question before, but I thought it was a good one. So true. But you talked about, that you were interested, or you felt the injustices that these people were suffering. And as you keep making this work, what would justice look like for the people who you've been filming with?
What would justice look like?
Yeah.
I don't know. I haven't seen it recently. Yeah.
That's a good answer.
Yeah. So, but right now I think I'm asking for very little, that's the film reason, is asking for very little. I just want people to think things out. I'm just saying, don't be stupid.
Good advice for everybody. Thank you, guys.